"Walter, you're becoming a problem." My daughter-in-law said those words across my own dinner table while my son stared down at his plate and said nothing. I waited for Derek to defend me. He didn't. Serena leaned back and folded her arms. "We have our own family now. You need to understand that." I looked at my son again. "Derek?" He finally raised his eyes, but only for a second. "Dad, maybe she's right. Maybe we need some boundaries." 6 words. That was all it took for me to understand that something in my family had changed while I wasn't paying attention. What Serena didn't know was that I had spent my entire career studying structures, especially what happens when people remove something they think they no longer need. And soon, she would discover that lesson for herself. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from today. My name is Walter Graves. I was 64 years old when my son allowed his wife to make me feel like an outsider in the family I'd spent my life building. I had been a civil engineer for nearly 4 decades, and the house where that conversation happened was one I'd designed myself. Carol, my wife, helped me plan every room. She wanted more morning light in the bedroom, a wide kitchen window, and a back porch large enough for family dinners. We broke ground in 1994 and moved in 2 years later. Derek was 11. He chose the bedroom at the end of the hallway because its window faced the oak tree he loved to climb. For more than 20 years, that house held everything I thought would last forever. Then Carol died in 2017, 4 months after being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. After she was gone, the house became the closest thing I had to her. Her handwriting was still inside the pantry door. The lavender bowl she kept beside the kitchen window stayed exactly where she'd left it. I couldn't bring myself to move either one. Derek was 32 by then and married to Serena. She had grown up wealthy, the daughter of a man who owned several car dealerships, and she viewed the world differently from Carol and me. Everything seemed to have a value, a purpose, a return. Still, I tried not to judge her. Derek loved her, and that was enough for me. Then Oliver was born in 2019. The first time Derek placed that baby in my arms, something inside me that had been frozen since Carol's death finally moved again. Oliver had her long fingers. Later, I began noticing her smile in him too. He became the brightest part of my life. When he learned to talk, he called me Pop Pop, and I never corrected him. At first, Serena seemed pleased that we were close, but as Oliver grew older, something gradually shifted. Visits became harder to arrange. A Saturday afternoon had to be planned days in advance. If I suggested taking Oliver to the park, Serena already had something scheduled. If I arrived earlier than expected, I could feel the irritation before she even opened the door. Derek always had an explanation. "She's tired. We've been busy. You know how it is with a young child." So I gave them space. I didn't want to become the lonely widower who expected his son to replace the life he'd lost. Instead, I tried to remain useful. When Derek needed advice, I gave it. When something broke, I helped. When their lives became difficult, I tried to make things easier. I never kept score because Carol and I had raised Derek to believe family wasn't a transaction. Serena seemed to see it differently. The more dependable I became, the more my help began to feel expected rather than appreciated. I noticed it in small things first. The way she interrupted me at dinner. The way she glanced at my old work shirts. The way conversations sometimes continued around me, as though I'd already left the room. None of it seemed serious enough to confront. Not until the night she looked directly at me and called me a problem, and my son allowed her to do it. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply watched Derek avoid my eyes and realized I needed to understand what had happened to us. Engineers don't ignore cracks because they're small. Small cracks tell you where the pressure is building. And that night, sitting in the house Carol and I had built, I finally saw the first crack clearly. I just didn't yet understand how deep it went. The first time Serena asked me for money, she never actually used the word ask. Oliver was 4 months old. We were having dinner at their apartment when she casually mentioned a house they'd found in Myers Park. 4 bedrooms, good schools, safe neighborhood, she said while showing me photographs on her phone. Derek smiled, but I could see tension behind it. "What's the problem?" I asked. Serena sighed. "The down payment is a little more than we planned." She paused, just long enough for me to understand. How much? Derek finally looked at me. Dad, you don't have to. 80,000, Serena said. Just a family loan. We'd pay you back. I should have asked for paperwork. I should have asked why they were buying a house that required $80,000 they didn't have. Instead, I looked at Oliver, sleeping against Derek's chest, and told myself the money wasn't for Serena. It was for my grandson. 3 days later, I transferred $80,000. Serena called immediately. Her voice was warmer than I'd heard it in months. Walter, you have no idea what this means to us. For a while, I believed I'd helped build something good. The Myers Park house was beautiful, 4 bedrooms, a large backyard, polished floors, and a kitchen that probably cost more than my first car. When I visited, Oliver would crawl toward me and pull himself upright against my knee. Those moments made the check seem irrelevant, but the word loan disappeared almost immediately. Nobody mentioned repayment. I didn't either. Then other needs began appearing. Never dramatically. Serena was too careful for that. A repair cost more than expected. Her car suddenly wasn't reliable enough with a baby. Oliver's preschool offered opportunities they didn't want him to miss. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Serena explained the problem. Derek stayed quiet. Then someone mentioned Oliver, and somehow I became the solution. I helped because I could, but something about the way they asked began to change. Gratitude became shorter. Requests became easier. Serena stopped sounding embarrassed about needing help and started speaking as though my contribution was simply the sensible next step. At the same time, my access to Oliver became more controlled. If I wanted to visit on Saturday, I needed to check first. If I suggested taking him somewhere alone, Serena usually had another plan. Yet whenever they needed something, my phone rang without hesitation. I noticed the contradiction, but I refused to name it. Loneliness can make an intelligent man very talented at explaining away things he doesn't want to see. After Carol died, being useful to Derek made me feel like I still had a place in his life. Helping Oliver made me feel connected to a future I might otherwise only watch from a distance. Serena understood that better than I did. She never demanded. She simply made each request sound reasonable, temporary, and somehow connected to being a good grandfather. And I kept saying yes. I told myself family helped family. What I didn't ask was whether family was supposed to call mostly when help was needed. One evening, after another conversation about an expense Serena thought I could easily handle, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at Carol's lavender bowl. I tried to remember the last time Derek had called simply to ask how I was doing. I couldn't. Then I tried to remember the last time Serena had invited me over without money, repairs, or some practical need appearing somewhere in the conversation. I couldn't remember that either. I still wasn't ready to believe I was being used. Derek was my son. Oliver was my grandson. Those facts were stronger than my suspicion. So I kept helping, and every time I did, I received just enough warmth to convince myself everything was fine. What I didn't understand yet was that a pattern had already formed. I just hadn't added up the numbers. Soon, someone who had known me for more than 20 years would ask one simple question that forced me to do exactly that. The question that finally forced me to stop making excuses came from Frank Calloway, my attorney and one of the few men who had known me longer than Serena had been alive. We were playing golf one Thursday afternoon when Frank stopped near the 7th green and said, "Walter, how much money have you given Derek and Serena this year?" I laughed at first. "I don't know exactly." Frank didn't move. "Yes, you do." There was something in his voice that made me stop pretending. I thought about the transfers, preschool payments, repairs, and all the little emergencies that somehow reached my checkbook. "Maybe 90,000, I said. "A little more," Frank nodded. Then he asked a harder question. "When was the last time you spent an entire day alone with Oliver without Serena managing it?" I opened my mouth and realized I didn't have an answer. Frank rested both hands on his golf club. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you to look at what's in front of you." I drove home thinking about that sentence. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with 18 months of bank statements spread in front of me. Numbers had always calmed me. Numbers didn't flatter you, manipulate you, or tell you what you wanted to hear. I started adding. The first $80,000 down payment. Then repairs. Preschool. The car. Smaller transfers I'd barely remembered making. By midnight, the total sat on my calculator. $237,000. I stared at it for a long time. Then I opened my calendar and counted something else. During those same 18 months, how many times had I spent meaningful time alone with my grandson, without Serena present, changing the schedule, or deciding when the visit ended? Twice. 2 times. $237,000 given freely to my son's family, and 2 afternoons where I had simply been allowed to be pop-pop. I hated myself for putting those numbers beside each other because Oliver wasn't something that could be purchased. That was exactly the point. I had never wanted money to buy access to my grandson. Yet somewhere along the way, Serena had created a system where my usefulness remained welcome even as my presence became inconvenient. I thought about every conversation I'd dismissed. Every time Derek called with a problem but rarely called, just to talk. Every time Serena mentioned an expense and somehow connected it to Oliver's future. Every visit that had to fit her schedule. Suddenly they weren't isolated moments anymore. They were a pattern. I sat there in the house Carol and I had built and finally admitted what I'd been avoiding. I was being managed. Serena knew exactly what kept me cooperative. She didn't need to threaten me. She only needed to give me enough time with Oliver to remind me how much I loved him, then make the next request sound like something a good grandfather would naturally do. The realization hurt, but Derek's part hurt worse. Serena hadn't raised him. I had. He knew who I was. He knew I would have helped him without manipulation. And still, he had allowed our relationship to become this. I called Frank shortly after midnight. You were right. He didn't say I told you so. That's why Frank had been my friend for decades. What did you find? $237,000 in 18 months. There was silence. And Oliver? He asked. Twice. Frank understood immediately. We talked for nearly 2 hours. He asked which accounts Derek could access, what recurring transfers existed, what estate documents I had signed, and whether Serena had ever explicitly threatened to restrict contact with Oliver. I answered everything. Frank told me not to make any sudden moves. First we understand the structure, he said. That language made sense to me. I had spent my career inspecting structures before deciding how to repair them. But even after seeing those numbers, part of me resisted the conclusion. Derek was still my son. I remembered coaching his little league team, teaching him to drive, watching him graduate while wishing Carol could have been beside me. I wasn't ready to believe that boy was gone. So I made one decision before doing anything else. I would give Derek one final chance to show me that I was wrong, and before long, across another family dinner table, he would give me his answer. I gave my son one final chance at Christmas. I invited Derek, Serena, and Oliver to spend the week between Christmas and New Year's at my house in Greensboro. I didn't tell Derek about the $237,000 I'd calculated. I didn't mention my conversation with Frank. I wanted 1 week without money between us. One chance to see whether the family I remembered was still there. I pulled Carol's ornament boxes from the attic and decorated the tree exactly the way she used to. Every ornament came from somewhere we'd traveled together. I stocked the kitchen with Oliver's favorite food and made up Derek's old bedroom for him. When they arrived, Oliver ran through the front door shouting, "Pop, pop," and wrapped himself around my legs. For a moment, everything felt right. Then Serena walked in. Within an hour, she had commented on the old kitchen appliances, the flooring, and how much value a renovation could add to the house. Derek barely noticed. He spent most of the afternoon looking at his phone. I told myself to be patient. On the 4th morning, I asked Derek if the 3 of us could take Oliver to the park. Just you, me, and him, I said. Derek looked at Serena before answering. She said they already had plans to visit one of her friends. Tomorrow, then? I asked. Derek nodded. Tomorrow came. Serena found another reason. We never went. That told me almost as much as the bank statements had. Then came New Year's Eve. I made Carol's pot roast, the same recipe I'd been cooking since 1988. Oliver sat beside me in his booster seat, while Serena talked about renovating the Myers Park house. We want to add a sunroom, she said. It would completely change the property. Sounds expensive. About $280,000. Then she stopped talking. Nobody needed to explain why. The silence itself was the request. I looked at Derek. He kept cutting his meat. Serena smiled. We were thinking it could actually be a good investment for you, Walter. Myers Park values keep rising. You're really investing in Oliver's future. You're asking me for $280,000? I'm saying it isn't really a cost. It's an investment. I understand the difference. I spent 22 years building a company. Her smile disappeared. We've been patient with you, Walter. I almost laughed. Patient? Yes. We've tried to make you part of our lives, but support needs to be reliable, not dependent on your moods. I put down my fork. I've given you $237,000 in 18 months. Derek finally looked up. Serena's expression changed for half a second. You've been counting? I checked my accounts. That's exactly what I mean, she said. Everything becomes emotional with you. The calls, the visits, showing up when we have our own plans. You make Derek feel guilty for having his own family. I turned to my son. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Is that what you think? Derek stared at his plate. Dad, look at me. He did. I searched his face for the boy who used to wait for me after baseball practice. The young man I'd helped through college. The son who sat beside me when Carol died. Tell me she's wrong, I said. Derek exhaled. She's not completely wrong. Something inside me went still. You have the money, Dad. We're not asking for something you can't afford. And lately, the calls, the visits. Serena feels like you don't respect our boundaries. I'm your father. I know. Then he said the sentence I would remember long after every dollar had stopped mattering. But this is my family. I looked at Serena. Then at Derek. Finally, I looked at Oliver, who was quietly eating beside me, too young to understand that his father had just drawn a line around the word family and left his grandfather outside it. I didn't argue. All right, I said. Serena seemed almost surprised. That's it? That's it. Later, I helped Oliver get ready for bed. We sat in Derek's childhood room and read 2 books about trucks. Halfway through the second, Oliver fell asleep with his fingers wrapped around mine. I stayed there in the darkness long after his breathing became steady. Downstairs, I could hear Serena and Derek talking. I couldn't make out the words, and I no longer needed to. Frank had shown me the numbers. Serena had shown me what she expected. And now Derek had shown me where I stood. The next morning, I hugged Oliver longer than usual before they left. Love you, Pop-Pop, he said. I love you too, buddy. Derek gave me a brief hug. Serena barely looked at me. I stood in the driveway until their car disappeared around the bend. Then I walked back into the house, closed the door, and called Frank. When he answered, I said only 3 words. It's time, Frank. Frank didn't ask what had happened when I said, it's time. He had been waiting for those words since the night we counted $237,000 across my kitchen table. Come to my office Monday, he said. Bring everything. I arrived with bank statements, brokerage records, estate documents, and every account Derek could access. Frank spread them across his conference table. From this point forward, Walter, we don't act angry. We act carefully. That suited me. Anger makes people careless. Engineers don't repair damaged structures by swinging hammers at whatever looks broken. First, we identify what carries the load. Over the next 6 weeks, Frank and I mapped every financial connection between me and Derek. 3 accounts gave him some level of access, together holding just over $400,000. There was a joint credit line I'd added him to in 2021, recurring transfers I'd allowed to become routine, and estate documents that gave Derek more future control than I was now comfortable with. None of it had been stolen. I had opened those doors myself. That meant I could legally close them, but money was only half the problem. Oliver, I told Frank. That's what Serena will use when the money stops. Frank nodded, which is why we prepare before anything changes. He introduced me to Patricia Hendricks, a family law attorney with 20 years of experience. Patricia wasn't interested in whether Serena hurt my feelings. She wanted dates, messages, canceled visits, witnesses, and patterns. I told her about the birthday visit Serena had approved 2 days beforehand, only to stop me at the door when I arrived. Oliver had seen my car through the window and cried as I drove away. Patricia wrote everything down. "Document from now on," she said. "Don't provoke anyone, don't threaten anyone, and don't make Oliver part of an argument about money." I never would. Good. Then make sure the record shows that. So I did something harder than confronting Serena. I behaved normally. I answered Derek's brief calls. I kept scheduled visits. I didn't mention the dinner or his words, "This is my family." Most importantly, I didn't suddenly stop the regular financial support. Frank thought changing the pattern too early would reveal what we were preparing. Serena needed to believe nothing had changed. On the surface, nothing did. Underneath, everything was changing. Patricia documented every restriction involving Oliver. Frank prepared the financial paperwork. We revised the structure of my estate so that whatever eventually went to Oliver would be protected for Oliver, not placed directly under Derek or Serena's control. Frank and Patricia would serve as co-trustees. If something happened to me, my grandson would still be provided for, but nobody could treat his inheritance like another household account. Meanwhile, I prepared somewhere to go. Carol and I had bought a small cabin outside Brevard in 2009, 2 acres bordering Pisgah National Forest. We'd spent weekends there before she became sick. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to return. Too many memories lived in those rooms. But now the cabin represented something different. Distance. Quiet. A place Serena couldn't turn into another negotiation. I hired a local company to clean it, replace the water heater, check the roof, and stack enough firewood for the season. On my first trip there, I brought Carol's lavender bowl and placed it on the kitchen windowsill. For the first time in years, it looked like it belonged somewhere again. Back in Greensboro, I started sorting what mattered. Carol's photographs, my old drafting tools, Oliver's drawings I'd saved from the refrigerator, clothes enough for several weeks. I packed slowly so nobody would notice. Every step felt strange because part of me still expected Derek to call and say, "Dad, I was wrong." He never did. His calls remained short. Serena remained polite whenever she needed something. And I continued acting like the Walter they understood, the widowed father who would always be available, always help, always forgive the next small humiliation. They had no idea that behind that routine, 6 weeks of preparation were almost complete. Frank had the documents ready. Patricia had the legal strategy ready. The cabin was waiting. And I had finally accepted something I'd resisted for months. If I wanted to know whether my son valued me or merely what I provided, I had to remove the thing they had learned to depend on. Not Oliver. Never Oliver. The money. By early February, there was nothing left to prepare. All that remained was choosing the morning when the structure of our family would finally have to carry its own weight. On February 6th, I woke at 5:12 in the morning and made coffee in the kitchen Carol and I had shared for more than 30 years. By noon, my son would discover that the version of his father he'd grown accustomed to no longer existed. At 8, I met Frank at the bank. We started with the 3 accounts Derek could access. His authorization was removed from all of them. Just over $400,000 became mine alone again. Next came the joint credit line I'd added him to 2 years earlier. Closed. Then the recurring transfers that had quietly become part of Derek and Serena's monthly budget stopped. Frank watched me sign the final page. "You sure?" "I've been sure for 6 weeks. None of this took money that belonged to Derek. I wasn't emptying his accounts or leaving him with debts I'd created. I was simply closing access to my assets and ending financial support I had voluntarily provided. That distinction mattered to me. This wasn't punishment. It was a boundary. Our next stop was Frank's office, where I signed the revised estate documents. Derek would no longer have control over what eventually passed to Oliver. My grandson's inheritance would remain protected in trust, with Frank and Patricia overseeing it until Oliver was old enough to manage it himself. I read every page twice before signing. "Done," Frank said. I looked at my watch. 11:43. 38 years of engineering had taught me that major structural changes often look surprisingly small on paper. A few signatures, a few removed permissions, yet the weight shifts immediately. By 1 o'clock I was driving west toward Brevard with Carol's photographs, my drafting tools, 2 suitcases, and Oliver's drawings packed in the back of my SUV. I didn't leave Derek a dramatic letter. I didn't send Serena a message. They had told me they needed boundaries. I was finally giving them some. The cabin appeared between the trees shortly before sunset. I carried my bags inside, lit the fireplace, and placed Carol's lavender bowl on the kitchen windowsill. Then I turned off my phone and listened to the silence. For the first time in months, nobody needed anything from me. The next morning, I turned the phone back on. 17 missed calls. 12 from Derek. 5 from Serena. I didn't have to guess what had happened. At 8:07, Derek had tried to access the brokerage account. At 8:11, he'd called again. By 8:30, the messages had changed from confused to angry. Dad, call me. Then, something's wrong with the account. Then, did you remove me? Serena's messages were more direct. Walter, we need to discuss what you've done. Not, are you okay? Not, where are you? Not even, why did you leave? Their first concern was the money. I sat beside the fireplace and read every message twice. Somewhere inside me, a small part had hoped Derek would notice my absence before he noticed the missing access. He didn't. At 9:16, my phone rang again. Derek, I let it stop. 30 seconds later, Serena called. I let that one stop too. Then a voicemail arrived. Walter, this is irresponsible. You can't make financial decisions like this without discussing how they affect the family. I almost laughed at the word family. 6 weeks earlier, Derek had looked me in the eyes and told me, this is my family, drawing a boundary that left me outside it. Now that my money had crossed the same boundary, suddenly I was part of the family again. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked outside. Pisgah National Forest stretched beyond the property, bare winter branches covering the mountainside. Carol and I used to sit on that porch with coffee and talk about retiring there someday. I had imagined we'd do it together. Life had given me a different ending. My phone buzzed again. This time Derek sent only one sentence. Dad, where are you? I stared at it longer than the others. That was the first message that wasn't about an account. I still didn't reply. Not yet. I needed him to experience something I'd experienced for nearly 2 years. Uncertainty, not cruelty, not fear. Simply the realization that my presence could no longer be assumed. By evening, the calls stopped. I made dinner, placed Carol's bowl beside the window, and slept better than I had in months. But I knew the silence wouldn't last. Serena had lost access to something she'd come to consider reliable, and I knew enough about her to understand that she wouldn't accept it quietly. Money had been the first pressure point. The next one would be far more painful, because there was one thing she could still control that mattered to me more than every dollar I'd just protected. Oliver. Serena waited 4 days before showing me what the money had really cost me. I called Derek on Sunday evening not to discuss the accounts, but to ask whether I could speak to Oliver. Derek answered after the 5th ring. Dad, we need to talk about what you did. We can. Put Oliver on first. Silence. Then Serena's voice came through in the background. No. I heard Derek cover the phone, followed by a muffled argument. When he returned, his voice was lower. Serena thinks it would be better if you didn't talk to him right now. Better for Oliver? Better for everyone. I closed my eyes. Patricia had predicted this almost word for word. Tell Oliver I love him. Dad, just tell him. I ended the call and immediately wrote down the date, time, and exact words. The next morning, I called Patricia Hendricks. It started. She didn't ask what I meant. Send me your notes. By noon, she had them. 2 days later, Patricia formally requested a visitation schedule that would allow me regular contact with Oliver, independent of Derek and Serena's financial dispute with me. Their response came through an attorney. They opposed it completely. The argument was exactly what Patricia expected. I had abruptly withdrawn from the family, moved away without explanation, terminated long-standing financial arrangements, and was now behaving unpredictably. Serena wanted those decisions presented as evidence that I was emotionally unstable. When Patricia read the response to me, I almost admired the strategy. They've turned your boundaries into symptoms, she said. Can they make that work? Only if we let them control the timeline. Fortunately, we had started building that timeline 3 months earlier. Patricia had copies of canceled visits, text messages where Serena changed plans after I'd already arranged to see Oliver, and records showing restrictions existed long before I stopped the money. Frank supplied documentation proving every account I'd closed belonged legally to me. There had been no theft, no hidden transfer, no attempt to damage Derek's credit. I had simply stopped providing voluntary support. Then Serena's father became involved. He called Frank and suggested everyone could avoid an ugly family dispute if I restored certain financial arrangements and stopped pursuing formal visitation. Frank's answer was simple. Mr. Graves's finances and his relationship with his grandson are separate matters. That sentence mattered. It was exactly the separation Serena had never wanted. For weeks, nothing moved quickly enough. I stayed at the cabin, walking the trails Carol and I once loved, while every day without Oliver felt longer than the one before it. Then Patricia called on a Wednesday afternoon. "Walter, we have something important." Oliver's kindergarten teacher had been keeping a care log. During the previous month, Oliver had become unusually withdrawn. Twice he'd cried after family-related classroom activities. On one occasion, when asked what was wrong, he'd said, "I want Pop-Pop's house." Another entry recorded him asking when Pop-Pop was coming back. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. "He's asking for me?" Repeatedly. "Does Serena know about this?" The school contacted both parents. I felt anger rise, but Patricia stopped me before I could speak. "Don't call them. Don't send a message. Let me handle it. What are you going to do?" "Request temporary visitation immediately." The filing went in that afternoon. Serena's attorney objected, arguing that contact with me could confuse Oliver while the adults were in conflict. Patricia responded with the simplest point in the entire case. The conflict had begun between adults, but Oliver was the one being deprived of an established relationship. 3 days later, we received notice that Judge Diane Morales would review the request. I read the email twice. For the first time since leaving Greensboro, the fight no longer felt like Walter versus Serena. It was becoming a question someone neutral would have to answer. Was keeping a 6-year-old boy away from the grandfather he loved actually protecting him, or was it being used as leverage? That night, I sat beside the fireplace, holding one of Oliver's drawings I'd brought from Greensboro. 3 stick figures stood beneath an enormous yellow sun. Oliver, me, and a woman with purple hair he'd once told me was Grandma Carol in heaven. At the bottom he'd written, in uneven letters, "Pop, Pop, House." I had protected the money because I refused to be used. But I would have walked away from every dollar I owned before willingly walking away from that boy. Serena had assumed cutting off Oliver would force me back into line. Instead, she'd given Patricia the one piece of evidence we needed to put the question in front of a judge. And 48 hours later, Judge Morales made her first decision. Judge Diane Morales granted temporary visitation 48 hours later. Patricia called me at 7:14 that morning. "Walter, you got it." I stood beside the cabin window, unable to speak for a moment. "When?" "Saturday. 45 minutes at the Charlotte Family Services Center. Supervised. 45 minutes. After weeks without hearing my grandson's voice, it sounded both impossibly short and more valuable than anything I owned. I drove to Charlotte 2 hours early. Patricia met me outside and warned me not to discuss Derek, Serena, money, or the case. "This visit is about Oliver. Nothing else. That's all I've ever wanted." At 10:03, a caseworker led me into a small room with children's books, puzzles, and plastic chairs. I sat down and tried to keep my hands still. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. The door opened. Oliver walked in holding the caseworker's hand. For 1 second, he simply stared at me. Then his eyes widened. "Pop, Pop." He tore his hand free and ran across the room. I barely had time to stand before he crashed into me and wrapped both arms around my neck. Every bit of control I'd held on to for the previous 6 weeks disappeared. I dropped to my knees and held him. "I missed you," he whispered against my shoulder. "I missed you too, buddy." "Where did you go?" I swallowed. "I have a little house in the mountains now." He pulled back. "With bears?" I laughed through tears. "Probably not inside the house." "Can I come?" That question nearly broke me again. "I hope so." The caseworker sat quietly in the corner making notes. I remembered Patricia's warning and kept everything simple. No questions about Serena. No questions about Derek. No asking what anyone had told him. Oliver didn't need another adult pulling him toward one side. He needed his grandfather. So for 45 minutes, that was all I was. We built a crooked tower from wooden blocks. We ate crackers from paper cups. Then Oliver found a book about construction trucks and climbed onto the chair beside me. "Read this one." I'd read that same book to him dozens of times, but halfway through he interrupted me. "Pop, Pop? Yeah? Did I do something bad?" I closed the book. "Why would you think that?" He shrugged. "Because I couldn't see you." I felt something tighten in my chest. "No, Oliver, listen to me. None of this is because of you. You didn't do anything wrong. Promise?" "I promise." He studied my face as if deciding whether adults still deserve to be believed. Then he leaned against my arm and pointed back to the book. "Keep reading." So I did. When the caseworker announced we had 5 minutes left, Oliver's entire body changed. The excitement disappeared. He gripped my sleeve. "You're leaving again?" "I have to today." "When do I see you?" I didn't give him a date I couldn't guarantee. "I'm working on that." "Tomorrow?" "Not tomorrow." His eyes filled. "But you're coming back?" I knelt in front of him. "Oliver, look at me. Pop Pop loves you whether I'm 10 minutes away or 3 hours away. That doesn't change." He threw his arms around me again. The caseworker gave us another minute before gently saying it was time. At the doorway, Oliver turned back. "Pop Pop? Yeah, buddy? Promise you won't disappear?" There are promises adults shouldn't make when courts and other people control the calendar. But there are also promises that mean something larger than a date. "I promise I won't stop trying to see you." He nodded. "Okay." Then he disappeared down the hallway. I stayed in that room after the door closed because my legs weren't ready to carry me anywhere. The caseworker handed me a tissue. "He clearly has a strong attachment to you." I looked toward the empty doorway. "He's my grandson." Outside, Patricia was waiting. She didn't ask whether the visit had gone well. My face had already answered. "The caseworker will file her observations," she said. "They matter. I don't want Oliver dragged into a courtroom fight. He won't be. But the court needs to understand that this relationship is real and that losing it affects him." On the drive back to Brevard, I thought about the $237,000, the closed accounts, Serena's accusations, and every argument that had brought us here. Suddenly, all of it seemed very small. 45 minutes with Oliver had clarified what this had always been about. I could replace money. I could sell property. I could rewrite an estate plan. What I couldn't replace were years with my grandson once they were gone. That evening, Patricia called again. The temporary visit had produced exactly what she'd hoped for. An independent professional had now witnessed Oliver's attachment to me firsthand. The next step would be the formal hearing in April. Serena would have her attorney. Derek would be there. Patricia would bring the financial records, the canceled visits, the teacher's care log, and the caseworker's report. For the first time, everyone would have to tell their version of the story in the same room. And this time, a judge, not Serena, would decide whether I still had a place in Oliver's life. The April hearing lasted less than 2 hours, but by the time I walked into that courtroom, it felt as though my entire relationship with my son was about to be reduced to a stack of documents. Serena sat beside her attorney. Derek sat next to her, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the table. Patricia leaned toward me. "Stay calm. Let the record speak." Serena's attorney went first. He described me as a grieving widower who had abruptly withdrawn financial support, disappeared to the mountains, and then demanded court-ordered access to Oliver. Mr. Graves used money as leverage, he argued. When Derek and Serena established reasonable boundaries, he retaliated. Judge Diane Morales looked at me, then at Patricia. Response? Patricia stood. "The timeline says otherwise." She handed the judge an 18-page summary. The first section documented canceled and restricted visits with Oliver, beginning months before I stopped any financial support. The second showed the money, $237,000 in 18 months, given voluntarily to Derek and Serena. Mr. Graves never demanded visitation in exchange for money, Patricia said. In fact, he continued helping financially, while his access to his grandson became increasingly restricted. Serena's attorney interrupted. "Then why terminate everything at once?" Patricia didn't hesitate. "Because those were Mr. Graves's assets." Frank's records showed that the brokerage accounts belonged to me. The credit line could legally be closed, and the recurring transfers were voluntary. I hadn't taken anything from Derek. I had simply stopped giving. Judge Morales turned to Serena. Was Mr. Graves ever told that financial support was required to maintain contact with Oliver? Not directly, Serena said. But Walter expected access whenever he wanted. Patricia opened another section. Actually, he repeatedly requested visits in advance. She produced messages showing dates I'd asked to see Oliver and Serena's cancellations. Then came the kindergarten care log. Judge Morales read silently for several seconds. One entry recorded Oliver crying after a family activity. Another contained the words, "I want Pop-Pop's house." Serena shifted in her chair. Her attorney argued that children often struggled with family changes. Patricia agreed. Exactly. Which is why removing an established grandparent relationship should be based on the child's welfare, not an unrelated financial dispute. Finally, the report from my supervised visit was presented. The caseworker described Oliver running to me, hugging me immediately, asking why he couldn't see me, and showing a strong emotional attachment throughout the visit. Judge Morales closed the report. I see no evidence that contact with Mr. Graves is harmful to this child. Serena's attorney tried once more. Your Honor, the parents should retain discretion. Parental discretion matters, the judge replied. So does the evidence before this court? My hands were locked together beneath the table. I wasn't thinking about Serena anymore. I was thinking about Oliver asking, "Promise you won't disappear?" Judge Morales looked down at her notes. The temporary arrangement will be expanded. Mr. Graves will receive visitation every other weekend, subject to reasonable transportation arrangements, along with an extended period during summer vacation. I didn't move. Patricia touched my arm. You got it, she whispered. Across the room, Serena stared straight ahead. Derek finally looked at me. There was no anger in his face anymore, only exhaustion. Outside the courtroom, Serena left with her attorney without speaking to me. Derek remained behind. For several seconds, neither of us knew what to say. Then he stepped closer. Dad, I didn't know it had gotten that far. I looked at him. You were there. He flinched. I know. You were there when visits were canceled. You were there at New Year's. You heard her call me a problem. I kept telling myself it would settle down. So did I. Derek rubbed both hands over his face. I should have stopped it. I could have listed every moment he'd failed me. It wouldn't have changed anything. What happens now? He asked. That depends on you. What do you want me to do? I thought about the cabin, Carol's lavender bowl on the windowsill, and the empty room I'd already begun imagining Oliver sleeping in during summer. Come see me in Brevard. Derek looked surprised. You want me there? I didn't say everything was fixed. I paused. I said, come see me. He nodded slowly. Okay. I walked toward the parking lot with Patricia beside me. The hearing had given me something important, but it wasn't revenge, and it wasn't victory over Serena. A judge had simply confirmed what I'd been trying to protect from the beginning. My relationship with Oliver had value independent of my bank account. The money could stay behind its new boundaries. The trust could protect Oliver's future, but whether my son and I could rebuild what we'd damaged was no longer something a judge could decide. That part would have to happen somewhere quieter, somewhere in the mountains. 3 weeks after the hearing, I heard tires crunching over the gravel outside my cabin. By the time I reached the porch, Oliver was already climbing out of Derek's car. The moment he saw me, his face lit up. Pop, pop. He ran across the yard and threw himself into my arms. Is this your mountain house? It is. He looked past me toward the trees. Are there bears? I laughed. You remembered that? You said probably not inside. For the next hour, Oliver explored every corner of the cabin as if I'd built it specifically for him. He inspected the fireplace, counted the steps to the creek, and immediately claimed the small bedroom overlooking the woods. Derek followed quietly. He looked thinner than he had at the hearing. After lunch, Oliver sat near the creek, collecting smooth stones while Derek and I watched from the porch. Serena and I separated, he finally said. I didn't react. When? 2 weeks ago. I'm sorry. He looked surprised. Are you? I never wanted your marriage destroyed. Derek stared toward Oliver. We're selling the Myers Park house. Neither of us can keep it alone. The house I'd helped them buy with that first $80,000 was disappearing from their lives. Once, I might have viewed that as justice. Now it just felt sad. We're working through custody, he continued. It's ugly. Keep Oliver out of the middle. I know. Do you? Derek looked at me. I hadn't meant it cruelly, but I wasn't going to pretend the previous months hadn't happened. I'm trying to, he said. We sat silently until Oliver shouted that he'd found a rock shaped like a dinosaur egg. I waved and told him to keep it. Derek smiled faintly. He talks about you constantly. I talk about him too. Dad, he stopped. I should have defended you. I waited. At New Year's. Before that too. Every time Serena made you feel like you had to earn your place with us, I saw it. I just kept telling myself keeping her happy was easier than confronting it. It was easier, until it wasn't. That's usually how avoiding problems works, he nodded. When you stopped the money, I was furious. I know. But what scared me wasn't losing the accounts. It was realizing I didn't know where my own father was. That was the first thing he'd said that reached somewhere deeper than an apology. You could have called before you needed something, I said. I should have. Yes. He looked down at his hands. Can we fix this? I watched Oliver crouching beside the creek. We don't fix 30 years of being father and son in one conversation. Derek's face fell slightly. But we can start, he nodded. Later, the three of us walked along the water collecting stones for Oliver's growing pile. Nobody mentioned court orders, trusts, or the $237,000. For once, there was nothing to negotiate. Back at the cabin, Derek noticed Carol's lavender bowl on the kitchen windowsill. He picked it up carefully. Mom's. I brought it with me. He ran his thumb along the rim. I miss her. Me too. His voice cracked. She would have hated what happened to us. Probably. She would have yelled at me. I smiled. Definitely. Derek laughed. And for a moment I heard the boy he'd once been. That evening Oliver fell asleep on the couch, with his dinosaur-shaped rock beside him. Derek and I sat on the porch as the mountains disappeared into darkness. Nothing was magically repaired. Serena was still Oliver's mother. Derek still had consequences to face. And I still remembered every time he'd chosen silence when I needed him to speak. Forgiveness didn't erase any of that. It simply meant I was willing to see what we could build from what remained. I spent almost 40 years as an engineer. My job was to understand load-bearing structures, the parts of a building that carry weight quietly, while everyone notices the walls, windows, and polished surfaces around them. Serena had looked at me and seen an aging widower who could be useful when money was needed and inconvenient when he wanted a place in the family. Derek had allowed himself to believe the same thing. They learned too late that removing support without understanding what it carries can change the entire structure. But that wasn't the lesson I wanted Oliver to inherit. I didn't disappear to destroy my family. I disappeared because I finally understood that love without boundaries eventually becomes permission. The money stayed protected. Oliver remained protected. And Derek now had the opportunity to rebuild his relationship with me without a checkbook between us. Before going inside, I looked through the window at my grandson sleeping beneath one of Carol's old blankets. For the first time since leaving Greensboro, the cabin didn't feel like somewhere I'd escaped to. It felt like home. Maybe families weren't so different from the structures I'd spent my life designing. Sometimes damage couldn't be hidden. Sometimes parts had to be removed. But if the foundation was still worth saving, you didn't abandon it. You rebuilt carefully, one honest piece at a time.